My name's Faye McGuinness. I'm the Director of Programmes at Education Support, and I have the pleasure of taking you through this afternoon's webinar, which, as the subtitle says, is all about from burnout to balance. So this webinar is really about giving you some practical tools to think about how you can recognise, prevent and recover from burnout in education. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Just a couple of housekeeping bits. I would encourage you to put any questions into the question and answer panel. So I'll make some space at the end to answer any questions that come out. We are recording this webinar, so we will also send out a link to the recording so you can watch it again if you wish to, or we'd encourage you to share it with your colleagues as well for those that haven't been able to join us today. So that's the housekeeping out of the way. But before we get into it, I would just like us to spend a minute or so arriving in this online space. I can imagine that some of you have run here from another meeting or from the classroom. You may still be doing some work online. You may be multitasking. You may be feeling a bit frazzled from the day, a bit tired, or you may be coming from the back of a really positive day, feeling really ready to engage in the content. However you are arriving, that's absolutely fine. But I would just like you to, if you can, invite you to take just a moment, a breath, to allow yourself to arrive in this space. Obviously, you have given yourself permission to sign into the webinar. So I'd encourage you to give yourself permission to give this hour to yourself, to be able to kind of sit and listen and hopefully take away something that will be useful for you. So if you want to take a moment, take a breath. If you are going to multitask, maybe I'd encourage that it includes making a cup of tea while you're listening, but whatever feels comfortable for you. But I would encourage you just to take that moment to get yourself into the space and hopefully take something away that's going to be useful. Okay, so hopefully now that we've arrived, we're going to kick off by talking about what is burnout. So let's start by talking about what do we actually mean when we say burnout. So burnout is defined as a psychological syndrome that develops in response to chronic work stress. So when you look at the literature, that is how burnout is defined. And burnout involves three levels. It involves the individual, it involves an organisation, and it's also institutional. And it's a complex phenomenon and it has various aspects, but essentially it does involve those three levels. Now, like stress, burnout is not recognised as a medical condition in the same way as, for example, anxiety and depression is. But it is an occupational construct and it's related to work specifically, not necessarily the broader life stresses that we might experience as human beings. That's not to say that those broader life stresses may compound that burnout, but it is really an occupational construct. And burnout really describes the subjective experience of individuals in and of a workplace. And the impact of burnout can have a real significant impact on individual, so you as employees, the culture of a work environment, and ultimately an individual's effectiveness and how they contribute to wider society, back to that point that we're full humans, we're not just employees. So that is what burnout is. And that feels really important and really links to how we think about workplace wellbeing more broadly here at Education Support. And the fact that we need to pay attention to wellbeing at three levels. So if we take what Capone described burnout as being at that individual, organisational and institutional level, when we think about broader workplace wellbeing in education, then that exists at the individual level, and we need to make sure that there is support provided for individuals to think about their own wellbeing and to support individuals that might not be feeling well. But we need to recognise as the individuals, you work within a workplace. You work within a environment that will have its own policies and procedures and culture. And we know from our own research that 50% of education staff say that their organisational culture negatively impacts on their well-being. So workplace really matters when we want to think about how we can support people not to experience burnout. But we also know that you work within a wider education system, and that system has a number of challenges. We don't need to name them. I'm sure you understand what they are. And that system affects how the workplace operates, which impacts on how individuals feel. And so we have to pay attention to well-being at all three of these levels in the same way that we do when we talk about burnout. But what we do know is that the workplace and the system takes a long time to change. It's quite complex, it's slow. And there are still things that we can do at the individual level that can support us to prioritise our own well-being and to try and prevent burnout. And so that is what we're going to focus on today. It's not to ignore that we have to do stuff at the workplace and system level, but it really is recognising that there are things that we can do at the individual level. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how we can prevent burnout. So we start with preventing burnout. I want to share a couple of practical things. I want to talk you through some things that feel important in terms of building in those healthy habits. So it might not surprise you, but the first thing that I want to speak about is stress. So if we think about burnout being as a result of, stress, intense stress, then actually it's really important for us to think about how we manage our stress. And so what I specifically want to talk to you today about is our stress cycle and the importance of closing that stress cycle. So we know that we have many stressors. In the modern world, stressors are coming at us most days. They're external to us. They might be personal, they might be work-related. They're often a combination of the two. And managing a stressor, getting rid of a stressor, doesn't necessarily mean that what we're doing is dealing with the psychological and the physiological impact of that stress on our bodies. Managing or getting rid of the stressor is fixing the problem, but that's not the same thing as closing our physiological stress cycle. So when we're dealing with stressors, what we know is that our body can experience stress. Not with every stressor, not all of the time, but our body does respond to stressors by feeling stressed. And stress is a neurological and a physiological response inside of your body. And it's evolutionary and it's there to protect us, right? It's there to actually make us feel safe. And it floods your system with adrenaline and cortisol. And you would have heard regularly that it puts your body into fight, flight, or freeze. And in a lot of our conversations with the education workforce, we hear that a lot of staff sometimes reflect that they're in fight quite a lot, that their body is in fight mode. And so what does that mean in terms of a physiological response? So if I said to you, do you ever get that tense feeling in your shoulders when you're going to work? Do you get that kind of slight dread or that pit in your stomach some days when you're going to work? Are you experiencing headaches or brain fog? If you're sitting there sort of nodding your head behind the screen, that those could be some of those signs, those physiological signs that you are experiencing stress. So removing the stressor does not automatically turn off that stress response. So for example, if you've been through an Ofsted inspection, the actual inspection itself, we know that that can evoke quite a lot of stress. And actually, if the event of the inspection has finished, there is a likelihood that you are still feeling that stress. You are still feeling that tense in your shoulders, that pit in your stomach. So whilst the stressor has been removed, the physiological stress in your body remains. It's there, it's in your nervous system, and it's embedded within your body. So the job here is that we need to complete the stress cycle, because over time, when uncompleted stress cycles accumulate, that can lead to exhaustion and burnout. We can't just get rid of the stressor. This is a stress cycle. So if we look at danger, this is our stressors that we've just spoken about. And then our body goes into a stress response, which is the fight, flight, or freeze down here at the bottom of the stress cycle. And then we remove that stressor. So the Ofsted inspection has happened, or the Essen inspection has happened, and suddenly you are in feel safe. You feel safe because that stressor has been removed, but actually your body isn't safe. You need to move to that fourth bucket of the stress cycle, which is to be in the you are safe bucket. and that is what is closing your stress cycle. Now, there are evidence-based ways that you can close the stress cycle, and some of these might seem really obvious, but they're obvious because they are the things that work. So these are the 7 evidence-based strategies for completing the stress cycle. Physical activity, if you can build in 20 to 60 minutes most days, that may not be possible for everybody, and it certainly isn't about beating yourself up if you can't do these. Breathing, practicing really active breathing. Positive social interaction, so we know that the quality of our relationships and our relationships at work will have the biggest impact on our well-being. It's the biggest predictor of how well we'll be. Laughter is really important. Affection, crying, having a good cry really helps complete the stress cycle, and also creative expression, so that opportunity to be creative. So these are evidence-based strategies. There may be other things that you do to close your stress cycle, but the invitation to you is to reflect and think about, what do you do on a regular basis to make sure that you are closing those stress cycles so they're not accumulating, which could result in you feeling more stressed, more exhausted, and could possibly lead to burnout. So closing the stress cycle is really, really important. So that's stress. The next thing that I want to talk to you is about rest. Rest is really, really important, particularly if we want to make sure that we are well rested in terms of our mental health, our physical health, our emotional health. So I would invite you to think about if you were to go to the gym. You may not. I certainly don't. But if I were to go to the gym and I was to work this muscle on my arm, and I was using it every day, and I was pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, I think I could understand that that muscle eventually is going to get extremely tired. It's going to get so tired, actually, that I'm not going to be able to use it anymore. And so I would give it a rest. But actually, when it comes to our brains, when it comes to thinking about our mental health, we don't necessarily think the same. And so it's really important that we think about our brain in the same way that we think about other muscles, because quite frankly, it's one of the most important. And so the science tells us, and I can imagine there's going to be some eye rolling or some falling off chairs as I say this, but the science tells us that we should spend 42% of our day in rest, including sleep. That does include sleep. And it says that you might not be able to achieve that in a day, but over a week or over a month, it should be around 42% of time that we are in rest. So I would encourage you to kind of think about that, think about how much time you spend in rest. What the science also said is that 5 to 10 minutes can reduce feelings of fatigue and raise energy. So just taking 5 to 10 minutes to rest can be a supply of fuel. It isn't a bad thing to rest. Actually, it's absolutely vital if we want to be able to show up and be our best. But I also wanted to share what the research says about rest in terms of not just how well it is for our well-being, but also the research tells us that if we do give opportunity to rest and take breaks, it helps deepens our learning, which is absolutely essential in education. It helps us unlock fresh ideas because we can do our most creative thinking if our brain's not overtired. And also it increases interest and enjoyment in tasks. You know, we've all got those tasks that we sit there and we're thinking, I wish I could be doing anything else but this. But actually sometimes taking a break from it allows you to have a slightly increased interest and enjoyment in those tasks. So rest is not only good for ourselves and our well-being and to help prevent, exhaustion and burnout, but it's also good for our professional practice. So that's kind of a win-win. But it's important to say that rest isn't just about sleep, because actually, I can imagine that, we've all had those nights where we've had a really good sleep, and we wake up in the morning and we still feel pretty exhausted. And that's often because our brain doesn't go straight into rest. It needs time to recover before it can go into rest. So if you're lucky enough to be able to go on holiday and people say, the first few days I can't quite switch off, that's because you're often in recovery mode. So it's really important to think about that and how you're preparing, particularly for the end of the academic year, the end of academic terms. How is it that you're able to prepare yourself to be able to rest properly? So Dr. Sandra Dalton-Smith talks about the 7 types of rest, and I think these are really important because, like I say, rest isn't just about sleep. There are 7 types of rest. So we've got, the physical, sleeping included, yoga, stretching, slow movement, that can be, really restful, particularly yoga. Mental rest, so, taking short breaks, having some space to journal, actually just having some space to sit and not do anything, which I know is really, really hard. I struggle with that personally. Sensory rest, so we know in the modern age, you will all know this, of course, that devices can have a real impact on our senses and our ability to rest, particularly if they're being used late at night. Being creative, and that's again a type of rest, but also helps close your stress cycle. Kind of emotional rest, so the idea that we can express our feelings, which might not feel restful in the moment, but actually the evidence suggests that talking to somebody about how we're feeling can really alleviate and support our well-being. So finding somebody that you trust, the space where you can express those feelings. Social, hang out with supportive people that you get on with. And then for some people, that's spiritual rest, so meditation, being involved in the community, volunteering, giving to others. That as well is a type of rest. So when I say 42%, it doesn't mean that you have to be sleeping for all of that time. I wish we all could. But there are different types of rest. So I'd invite you to just think about, okay, well, where do you fall here? Do you have any of these types of rest in your routine? Which ones sort of stand out for you? Which ones feel like they resonate with you the most? And how can you build that into your day-to-day? So 7 types of rest from Dr. Sandra Dalton-Smith. Now, one of the things that we hear a lot is that, we don't really have time to take breaks, and we don't really have time for rest. And actually, if there was one thing that we could have that would improve our well-being, it would be more time. And that is something that we hear a lot from our conversations with education staff. And the reality is that we just don't have more time. There are no more hours in the day. And I guess the question is would the work of education ever be done, even if you had an extra 10 hours in the day? And the answer is probably not. So in recognising that, it can sometimes be helpful to think about, well, if we don't have more time, then how do we manage our personal energy? So what are the things that are using our energy, whether that's at work, whether that's in life? What are the things that really deplete our battery, that really bring it down to that low bar? And it can be really helpful to think about this for yourself. It can be really helpful to do it with a colleague or with a team. Or if you're a leader that's joined, you could do it with your team to think about at an organisational level, a team level, what are the things that are using up energy? And then the second part is thinking about, well, what are you doing to recharge that energy? So if we think about the stress cycle, if we think about the types of rest, there'll be other stuff that's important to you. But what are you doing to recharge that battery? And how are you building those small moments into your everyday? So again, it's really trying to reframe and recognizing that there are not enough hours in the day, and there will never be enough hours in the day to do the work of education. So where is our boundary, and how can we think about less about time and more about our own personal energy? Because actually, if we get the balance right and we start doing more of the recharging, then we are helping reduce that risk of feeling that exhaustion, of feeling that burnout. So, a really useful tool that you can do, as I say, for yourself, with your team, with a colleague, and something that you might want to revisit every academic term, every academic year, but it can be a really helpful practical tool to use. And another practical tool that I wanted to share with you to sort of respond to that, there isn't much time to kind of rest and take breaks, which, I completely appreciate is often the reality, is this wellbeing window. And the wellbeing window allows you to think about what could be done in 30 seconds what could be done in 3 minutes, or what could be done in 30 minutes that you could slot into your day to do something for yourself. So it could be one of the things to close your stress cycle. It could be anything else that makes you feel good, that kind of allows you to stop, allows you to relax, gives your nervous system that moment to just pause. Is there something that you can build into your day? 30 seconds, 3 minutes, 30 minutes. Now, often the response is 30 minutes feels too much. So I invite people to think about, well, what can you do in 3 minutes? What is it that you could do in 3 minutes? And again, this is something that you can do for yourself, you can do with your colleagues. You know, if you kind of want to have some of that holding each other to accountability, you know, what have you done in your 3 minutes today? It can be a really nice tool to be able to do that. And what this is really doing is allowing you to build those small habits. You know, they're not huge things. 3 minutes a day is not huge, but it's allowing you to build those healthy habits so that you have a strong foundation to build from. And sometimes that's all we need. We need the ability to be able to kind of build those smaller habits that over time can be built into bigger habits. But as I said at the beginning, none of this is about you need to do all of this and feel guilty if you don't, because absolutely we don't want anybody feeling guilty. But it is about building those very small habits. So using the wellbeing window can be a really good tool, and I'd encourage you to download it. I'll give you a link to our website at the end where you can see all of these resources that we're talking about today. So what I'm going to invite you to do, now that we've come to the section around kind of preventing burnout, is I just want you to take a moment on your own just to pause and reflect. And I want you to think about what has maybe stood out to you so far. Has anything sparked any fresh thinking for you in what I've shared so far? And I'd really appreciate or encourage you, if you feel comfortable to share any thoughts in the chat so that other people can see. But yeah, what has stood out to you? Have you had any fresh thinking? Feel free to pop in the chat and we'll just take a moment to reflect. Brilliant. Thank you. There's so much, amazing stuff in here. See that people are really liking the 3330, sort of building that into the day, the stress cycle and the closing of that, which is often quite new to people. Actually, we talk about stress a lot, and the idea of stress isn't stress, but yeah, it seems like you're appreciating the understanding of closing that stress cycle. And I think someone's made a comment here about closing the stress cycle, not just until the next holiday and break. That's so important. I think in your work in education, you're always, and I use the language that we hear often, sort of crawling to the end of term, crawling to the end of the academic year, and at which point you're in the mode of needing to recover before you can rest. So building in those moments of rest actually throughout the whole year can make all of the difference. So yeah, thank you very much for sharing your reflections on that. Really, really great. So next I want to talk about and look a little bit at, well, actually, the final point I wanted to make here at the end of that session is that we're not robots, we're human beings. And even though the robot overlords might be coming with AI and everything else, we are not robots. Our work is relational, your work in education is relational. And that means that actually prioritizing yourself, looking after yourself means that you can maintain those best relationships and do the best work that you can. So it's always really important to remember that we are not robots. So we've spoken a little bit there about kind of some of the practical things that we can do to try and prevent burnout. But we know in our conversations with education staff that there are a number of things that get in the way of maybe being able to spend time closing the stress cycle or resting or taking time for ourselves. There are a number of themes that come out. So I just want to touch on those themes because I think it's really, really important that we name them and talk about ways that we might want to overcome them. So one of the things we hear a lot is I feel guilty for taking time for myself. I feel guilty for resting. I feel guilty if I'm not working long hours. Guilt comes up a lot in our conversations. And so I really wanted to just talk a little bit about the power of guilt and naming and recognizing that that's a real thing. And it can be helpful to think about guilt in these circles, really. There are things that we should feel guilty about. So, as an example, we might treat somebody really poorly. We might be really, annoyed with somebody, and we might shout at them, and we might treat them poorly. And actually, we should probably feel guilty about that. And then on the other end, there are things that we shouldn't feel guilty about, but we do anyway. And with education staff, what we hear is the idea that I leave on time and I'm not working longer hours. I feel guilty that I can't give everything that I need to every pupil because of the kind of workload and the work intensity. There's a whole bunch of things there that are often outside of your control that you feel guilty about. And one of those is having rest and having time for yourself. So there are things that you feel guilty about, but you shouldn't do anyway. And then there's kind of everything in between that might be a kind of mix of both. So what I wanted to touch on really is if you are somebody that finds yourself feeling guilty for taking time for yourself, resting, doing the things that you need to make sure that you can show up day in, day out, then here are some tips. The first thing is it's really important to reflect and acknowledge the guilt. Taking time to reflect on what drives our guilt and acknowledging your feelings is really important because, as I put here, guilt and shame grow legs when they're hidden, when we don't talk about them. So just getting into that habit of practicing saying, I notice that I feel guilty for taking a break, but I'm not doing anything wrong. Recognizing, acknowledging, reframing can be a helpful start in terms of being able to name the fact that we are feeling guilty about these things. Treat rest like an important work meeting. So practice and consistency really helps. And we really do need to redefine what productivity means. And actually what we have learned about rest is that actually if we take time to rest, then not only is it good for our own self and our own well-being, but it also has positive impacts on our professional being. So actually if we treat work like it's, rest like it's another work meeting and get into the habit of doing that, that's building some of those small habits that could become bigger habits. So track your successes. So feelings of guilt can be all-consuming. So if you are somebody that finds that you feel guilty quite a lot of the time, it can be all-consuming. And so trying to aim for some balance by recognizing the good stuff that you're doing. So if you get to the end of the day and you feel guilty about the fact that you didn't get to do something or you haven't quite done the bit that you wanted to do before tomorrow, aim for some balance by actually saying, but what are all the things that I did do? What are the things that I did achieve today? So that positive affirmation. It can be really helpful to seek perspective. Often when we're in our own heads and we're sort of feeling guilt and, we're keeping that to ourselves, then we're not necessarily getting a different perspective, which can be really helpful for us. So consider the situation from a broader perspective. And if you have a colleague, a family member, or a friend that you feel comfortable talking about, then absolutely you can do that. I'm going to share the information for our helpline. And if you would like to speak to somebody that's external to colleagues, family, or friends, you can absolutely call that helpline. But sometimes talking it through with somebody else to kind of seek a perspective, and maybe that's somebody outside of the education sector, which might be helpful in terms of seeing that different perspective in terms of taking time to rest. It can be really, really helpful. Practice self-compassion. So we've got to treat ourselves with kindness and understanding, because if we don't treat ourselves with kindness and understanding, how can we expect anybody else to do that? Talk to yourself in the way that you would talk to a colleague, a family, or a friend. How would you talk to them if they came to you and said, I'm really tired, I'm starting to feel exhausted, I'm worried about the fact that I might be starting to feel some burnout, but I feel really guilty about taking some time to rest. What would you say to them? And I encourage you to practice saying that to yourself. And as I mentioned, we've got our helpline where you can get free emotional support, and there'll be a slide at the end with more details on that. But, if you find that you need to speak to somebody and sort of that guilt is all consuming, then please do reach out for that support. So that's guilt. The other thing that comes up a lot is actually, the things that can cause us quite a lot of stress are the things that are outside of our control. And so when we think about what I spoke about at the beginning, if we think about well-being at the individual, the organisation and the system, there are many things in the system that are impacting on your experience at work that you have very little control over. But actually, you can spend quite a lot of time thinking and worrying about those things. So this is a tool that is well known, been well used, so you may have seen it already, but I think it's a really brilliant tool in terms of thinking about, well, what are the things that are in your circle of control? Because if you can focus on the things that are in your circle of control, that is going to have a more positive impact because you're going to feel like empowered that you can make the difference and make the change. So what is in your circle of control? And you can think about that for yourself as an individual. Again, you can do that as a team. You can do that, with a colleague. What is in your circle of control? The things that you can manage. What are the things in your circle of influence? So they might be things that sit at that organisational level. You might be able to influence some of the stuff around culture or relationships or policies or procedures. So what are the things that you can influence? And then lastly, thinking about what are the things that you are concerned about, but you have no control over. And the art here is trying to name the things that you're concerned about, but accepting that you have no control over those and really focusing back in on the things that are within your circle of control. So again, this is a helpful tool. You can get out a piece of paper and kind of draw the 3 circles. And again, it could be something that you do in an academic term, an academic year, it could be done in your personal life, in your work life, but it really allows you to kind of zone back into what is within your control. Because if we spend a lot of time worrying, ruminating on the things we have no control over, that can certainly lead to us feeling stressed and potentially anxious, not in all cases, but could lead to that. So thinking about what's in your control is really important. Another thing that we hear is, well, what if I'm somebody that fears the worst? What if I'm somebody that catastrophizes? And I would put my hand up and say, this has definitely been me in the past, and I've had to do a lot of work around this. And this quote really sums it up well. We don't see the world as it is. We see it as we are. And so, again, you might be somebody sitting there thinking, yep, this is me. I can kind of fear the worst. I can catastrophize. And again, this can have an impact on how we feel. If we're spending a lot of time in that catastrophizing state, that can be having an impact on our physiological body and what's going on for us. So it can be really helpful if you are somebody that might find themselves in that space to test yourself. So think like a scientist, test the validity of your thoughts and challenge yourself. Now, you might want to do that with somebody else. You might want to do it with a colleague or a friend. Again, whatever you feel comfortable with. But it can be really nice, going back to my point about getting a different perspective. So there are some questions here that you could ask, is the thought that I'm having absolutely true? And what if the opposite were true? What could be the good that could come out of this? What am I predicting, and actually how realistic is this? What's a more realistic to or balanced thought? And am I confusing this thought with fact? Because quite often when we are catastrophizing or fearing the worst, we're pulling from many, 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 many years of data that we have built up from our personal lives, our professional lives, and all of that data tells us a story. And sometimes it's when we're in these modes, we need to kind of check whether that story is still valid and still true. So act like a scientist, test the validity of your thoughts. And I encourage you, if you have someone that you feel comfortable, to kind of have this conversation with them. And it can be a really nice tool just to kind of get that different perspective. And if you are somebody that does spend a bit of time thinking about the things that you can't control, which, is absolutely natural, and so many of us do it, there is something that you could maybe put in place, which is a CBT technique, a cognitive behavioural therapy technique, which is about creating a boundary around that worry time. So they call it worry time, and you can create a comfortable space, make a cuppa, whatever you fancy, practice writing down your concerns. So the things you have no control over, write down those concerns, really practice not trying to find those solutions, talk them through if needed. You may not need to, but really practice not trying to find those solutions, and then put it away once the time is up. So what you're physically doing is you're getting your concerns down, you're putting it away, and it's out of sight. Now, that's not to say that it's completely out of mind, but what it is allowing you to do is to put a boundary around that worry. And then what you can do is, whether it's a week later, 2 weeks later, a month later, you can come back and you can get the piece of paper out again and you can write what you're concerned about. And it might be the same thing, but what you're doing is you are practicing, again, small habits of putting some boundary around that overthinking, that rumination, that fearing the worst. And it can be a helpful technique for people, not for everybody. And I think I'd really want to stress that not all of this is going to be relevant to all of you. And some of it you're thinking, I'm absolutely not going to do that. And some of it you might. So take what feels most relative to you and what you think you would like to engage with. And then the other thing that we hear is around perfectionism. So this idea that we have to be perfectionists. And again, I'll put my hand up and say, I have definitely been far at the end of the perfectionist scale. And that can have a real impact on us if we are constantly in that phase of thinking like we have to be perfect. And when we work in a sector, when you work in a sector where there are high accountability, high stakes, that is understandable, that you might feel that sense of needing to be perfect. But I would just invite you to kind of listen to some of the stuff that the research says about perfectionism. The first thing is that perfectionism doesn't equal performance. Perfectionism doesn't mean better performance. And I think it's really important to hold that in mind, particularly if you're somebody that sits there and feels like you have to be a perfectionist, much of the time. Doesn't equal performance. What the research also says is that for some perfectionists, there are three things that they might do. They might obsess about the details that don't really matter. So they don't have the discipline to find the right problems to solve. So you spend so much time in that minor detail that actually, you're unable to kind of look at the wider issue and the right problem that actually needs to be solved. And we can spend a lot of time in the detail when actually we can lift our heads out of that. The second is that perfectionists might avoid unfamiliar situations and might avoid doing anything that leads to failure. And actually, failure is where we learn. Failure is where cognitively, we develop. And so actually, if we avoid failing, then we're doing a disservice to ourselves. And then the third bit is that perfectionists in the research have found, not all of the time, but can berate themselves for making mistakes. And if we berate ourselves for making mistakes, that can be really hard for other people then to learn from us. And so, whether you're a leader on here, whether you're not, if we are showing our colleagues, our staff, that it's not okay to get things wrong or it's not okay to fail, then we're not really creating an environment in which it is safe for people to be able to do that. So I guess I just wanted to land the point there that, perfection doesn't equal performance. And if we're putting a lot of pressure on ourselves, if you're putting pressure on yourselves to be a perfectionist, then maybe consider some of the things that I've shared with you today and reflect on that. So again, I'm going to pause and reflect. So that section was just really looking at some of the things that come up for education staff around why it's hard to kind of rest, pause, close the stress cycle, all that stuff around not having time. So I'm really keen, what has stood out to you in that section, the section that we've just done? Again, have you had any fresh thinking? And I'd invite you to share any thoughts in the chat. Yeah, a lot of teachers are perfectionists, one comment says. Yeah, great. So lots of stuff around the perfectionism that really landed, and that it doesn't equal performance. So that seems to have landed, and the circle of control and influence. Great, thank you. Really good to see those reflections in the chat as well. Great. So what I just want to go on to now is what are the signs of burnout? So we've kind of looked at prevention, we've looked at some of the things that get in the way of prevention, and now I just want to very quickly go on to the signs of burnout. So the kind of three main signs of burnout are feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance or feelings of, feeling negative or cynicism related to one's job, and reduced professional efficacy. So they're the kind of headings in terms of what those signs of burnout are. But let's look at what sits underneath those signs. So I'll give you some examples. So some physical signs might be that you have some unexplained ailments. So you might start to notice you have frequent headaches or muscle or joint pain or stomach pains, things that you can't quite explain. It may be that you start to notice that you have a weakened immunity and you're starting to get a lot of coughs and colds and things that you might not have been prone to get before. And also sleep issues could absolutely be a physical sign. Emotional signs might include you feeling more feelings of doubt and helplessness, more than typical or more than you might in the past. Or to this point around reduced professional efficacy, one of the emotional signs is that you might see decreased satisfaction, and maybe not just in work, but broadly in life. Behavioural changes, so that can include withdrawal, so you're withdrawing, seeing an increase in procrastination, not being able to make decisions, maybe lashing out, and for some people, coping mechanisms such as alcohol or unhealthy eating or things that you might be relying on as a kind of crutch. And then I guess the mental, the cognitive, some of the signs are brain fog. That could be other things, obviously. That kind of cynical framing, if you find yourself being really negative or cynical about everything or most things. And again, lowered productivity. So there's a kind of bunch of stuff in that, and you may be sitting there thinking, well, actually, I feel some of those things. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're experiencing burnout, but it's for you to really keep an eye on and to recognise whether some of those signs are there, whether a lot of them are there, whether they are consistent and have been around for a long time. And if you are, then actually it can be really important just to reach out and talk to somebody about it. And like I say, you might be feeling some of those things and it may not be signs of burnout, but it's really important that we understand what some of those signs might be. So if we've got the prevention, but we recognise that there may still be things that are happening in our lives that cause us to feel exhausted and have burnout, what do we do to recover? So I just want to share a few things to help think about recovering from burnout. First thing is that we have to prioritise radical rest. So if we go back to what I spoke about earlier about rest, if we are recovering from burnout, then we really need to prioritise that radical rest. It could be a really important time to establish boundaries. So having those conversations with your colleagues, with your manager, with your team, with your loved ones around what those boundaries are. What are your non-negotiables? We talk about well-being, non-negotiables. Do you have any well-being non-negotiables? Have you shared them with anybody? But it can be this can be a really important time to establish those boundaries to sort of get you back into that preventative mode. Actively close your stress cycle. So, if you come out of a period of exhaustion and burnout, it's even more important that you pay attention to that closing of your stress cycle. Having grounding relationships. So all of the stuff that I've spoken about is really important, but actually, as I said, the most fundamental thing in terms of our well-being is the quality of our relationships. So having one or two people that allow you to have that grounding relationship can be really, really effective in terms of kind of overcoming a period of difficulty. Some gentle, regular movement. So that kind of physical movement can really have an impact on us, our mental health, our emotional health, our physiological health, and actually trying to move some of that out of our body can be really important. And so I think there's something here about if we come out of a period of exhaustion or burnout, we may not want to be doing, hardcore exercise, but actually going out for a gentle walk in nature, building that into the routine could be really important. And then lastly, really do seek support if needed. There are organisations like ourselves that are here to support. And so, if you feel like you're coming out of a period of burnout, it's okay to still reach out to talk to somebody. It doesn't have to be, well, I'm coming out of it, I'm okay, but seek that support if needed. So here's our helpline that I spoke about. It's free, it's confidential, it's open 24/7, and you can speak to a qualified counsellor. You can have up to an hour on the phone with them. And so if you are wanting to talk about anything that's impacting on you, then I'd recommend that you reach out to the helpline. And if you haven't got one of these posters in your school or college, university, or anywhere, then please do make sure that you've got it up. So the helpline is really important. Our website has got lots and lots and lots of information. All the stuff that I've spoken about today, you can find it on the website. There's lots of tools, there's lots of resources, and you can also sign up for our newsletter, and then you get it into your mailbox every month, and there's lots of new stuff that we can send you. So please do sign up if you haven't done that already. And I guess I would sort of end the kind of content of this webinar by saying that this quote by Audre Lorde really kind of encapsulate what I've been saying today, that caring for yourself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political welfare. So if you want to show up every day doing the incredible work that you do in terms of educating, supporting children and young people, then you have to start with yourself. And that really isn't self-indulgence. It really is self-preservation. So I think that I'm going to go to questions first before I finally wrap us up. So I'm going to go into the chat, and I'm hoping that my colleague Amy is going to pop some questions in there. So there's a question here about what does a person do if they do not maintain a daily routine? So I think what I would suggest, and it looks different for every single person because we all have different responsibilities, we all have different lives. So if a person is unable to maintain a daily routine, then I would say start with those very small habits. So some of them I've shared today. Can you do the 3-3-3 window? Is that a small habit that you can build in? Is there one well-being non-negotiable that you can build into your life? And so start with those small habits, because often, we hear of people, I'm really guilty of this, new year, new me, I'm going to achieve all of these big goals. And it's really, really difficult to maintain those. So if you're not maintaining a kind of daily routine, start with those small habits and actually celebrate them and recognize that you're doing them. Just because they're small doesn't mean that they're not important. They need to be recognized. So what if you're working more than 50% of your day? Thank you, Rachel. So if you're working more than 50% of your day, then again, I would go back to what is it that you can build into that day that allows you to have those small moments of rest and recovery. So, if you're working 50% of your day, what percentage of that 50% can you take time to pause and reflect? And as we've discussed, it doesn't have to be an hour. It can be a few minutes. So if you're working more than 50% of your day, then actually it's even more important that you build those habits into the working day. I think it's also really important, if you're working more than 50% of your day, that you're able to put that kind of real boundary between that work and home, because actually 50% of your day is a lot of time. And so what are the things that you're doing to make sure that you're able to put that boundary between work and home? And again, that might be a well-being non-negotiable that you want to share. So how do we navigate a possible underlying culture of cynicism about taking time for ourselves? So thank you, Craig. I think that is really a really important question, actually, because it goes back to what we discussed at the beginning around well-being being at 3 levels: the individual, the organisation, and the system. So actually, whilst we're here talking about what you can do at the individual level, we do a lot of work working with schools, colleges, thinking about how do you create a culture which prioritises staff well-being. And what we know about that is that if staff have better workplace well-being, then actually performance is better, recruitment is better, retention is better. So I think it's really important that when we're trying to challenge that culture of cynicism, that we actually go back to dare I say, the business case of why actually taking time for ourselves, why supporting staff mental health and workplace wellbeing is actually better for organisations. And so that is quite a lot of work that we do with schools and colleges, and to think about how do you create that culture and why does it matter. But of course that also has to come from the system. And we work with governments, and we encourage them to think about staff wellbeing in that policy making. But we've got a long way to go. But I think it's really important, and I think there's a question for everybody in this webinar about what are your organisations doing to really kind of prioritise staff mental health and wellbeing. And if it's you may be anywhere on the scale, and I'd encourage you to come to our website to think about how you might get started or build on what you're already doing. Question from Louise: if you suffer from burnout, are you more prone to it in the future? So there's no evidence to suggest that you are more prone to it in the future. So no, but actually, what's really important is going back to what we spoke about in terms of recovering from burnout. So if you come out of a period of burnout, but actually you're not really out of it, and then you go back to or maybe continue what you were doing before, and you haven't kind of put those steps in, then it may be that because you're not fully sort of recovered from it, that there is a risk there. But and that's not to say that the 6 things that I've given you are everything that you can do to recover from burnout. There will be other things that you can do, and not all of them will work for everybody. But I think the really important thing is to give yourself the time that you need if you have been through a period of burnout or exhaustion to do the things that we've spoken about, and to really think about where your boundaries are, how you are going to work on your stress cycle, how you're going to build in that rest. And really importantly, who is there for you to talk to and to get support from. So those things really, really, really matter. So thank you for that question. So Karen has put a comment: I think the Nolan principle should be changed as being selfless is one of them. I think it's really a really important point, and I think it's a really good reflection. If you think about the work that you do in education, if we don't start with self, if we don't look after ourselves, then how can we expect you to show up mentally, physically, emotionally in the classroom day in, day out? And I think there was a comment around, what does Audre Lorde mean by political warfare? And actually that's the point that she's making. It's actually that, we can't expect individuals to show up day in, day out within systems that might not necessarily be conducive to them feeling at their best. We can't expect that. So actually being able to look after ourselves, support our own well-being isn't just a nice to have, it's actually essential, it's absolutely vital. And Rachel, you made a really good point there that no one can pour from an empty cup, which is absolutely correct, and seems like a really lovely place to kind of end. Well, listen, all that's left for me to say is 2 things and a thank you. We're a charity, and it's really important for us to be able to do these webinars for free and to give out all of our resources on our website for free. And we can only do that because our supporters are so generous. So if you've enjoyed the webinar and you have got anything to spare, I know times are hard, but anything to spare and you want to donate, it really, really matters. It means that we can deliver more of these webinars. So there's a QR code there, or you can go to educationsupport.org.uk/donate, and we would be incredibly grateful for whatever you can give. Also, we want feedback. We want to make sure that we're delivering webinars that resonate, that give people what they need. So if you wouldn't mind, we'd really appreciate if you were to scan this QR code to give us some feedback, or you can go to educationsupport.org.uk webinar feedback. I'm sure we'll probably send the link out when we send out the recording, but it really does help us improve our webinars. So any feedback that you can give would be greatly appreciated. And finally, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for joining. I hope I've given you enough time to watch the football if you want to. And I just want to actually say thank you for the incredible work that you do with our young people, our children and young people in, in education settings day in, day out. You do an incredible job. We're here to support you. So please reach out if you need anything else from us. And have a lovely evening. Take care.